Hello again, everyone. Welcome back to the Mapping Hour. This is hour number 2. And here we are back again. And again, you can get a hold of us if you need to, all 4 of us, through mappinghour@esri.com. Let's take a look at the last hour. Just a very quick review. Talked a little bit about the school bundle that any of the schools anywhere can get access to at esri.com/schools. We went through the ArcGIS Online 5x5, and you can go back and see that. And the Compare app, that was a really fun set of activities, really focusing on getting comfortable with GIS. And you could do that without being logged in. That's really one of the exciting parts about what you saw in that episode. Reminder, you're going to need a login for hours 4 through the end. So if you don't have a login yet, make sure that you complete that survey at esriurl.com/mappinghour, because that way you can request a login. If you've already done that survey and you didn't indicate that you need a login, just go back and do it again. That's okay. Because what we're going to do today is going to lead into everything from here on out. What we're going to do in this hour is to focus on looking at the content that you can teach with GIS. In the last hour, we were looking at GIS as the focus of our exploration. How do these tools work? That's the really exciting part, learning these new tools. Great. Now you want to use these tools for a purpose. The content of the first hour was really focusing on the tools. The content of this hour is focusing on the academic content that you want to teach with these tools. So this is thinking about teaching with GIS instead of teaching GIS. We've got a set of geo-inquiries that we're going to be working with. You'll get to see more map viewer tools, and as part of this all, you get to jump in through features and attributes and tables. Oh my! Without further ado, I'm going to stop sharing and turn it over to Tom. Rock on in.
Thanks, Charlie. So we're going to spend some time today talking about something called geo-inquiries. Geo-inquiries are short instructional activities that are designed to teach content, and they use GIS to help direct or enhance that content. Geo-inquiries were designed a few years ago specifically for classroom use. So originally when they were designed, we had teachers in mind, and teachers delivering these short content bits through a computer and projector. So we'll show you an activity or two here in a moment, but the idea is that a teacher can use a verbal script to walk the students through using a map to answer a variety of questions around some topical areas. Now, I said a couple of interesting things there for the parents watching this. These activities, geo-inquiries, are content forward, they're content focused. Sometimes that means the content in these activities assume a base level of knowledge about a particular area of study. For example, as a parent, you may not be necessarily comfortable with a lot of aspects of, say, geometry or algebra. Yet when you're doing one of these geo-inquiries from the math collection, it assumes that there is a base level of knowledge. So for parents in particular, one thing to think about is using these activities as a review for your students, for your children. So choose the geo-inquiries that make sense, that enhance or refresh your students' content knowledge in these different discipline areas. Now, geo-inquiries today come in 10 different collections. It's a variety of science content and social studies content. We also have an upper elementary activity as well as a collection for math and one for American Lit. And today, with Kylie and Joseph's help, we're going to run through a couple of examples of some of these activities. So, as I mentioned, geo-inquiries are short. They're effectively 15 minutes when delivered in a classroom. We've got some workarounds and some alternative solutions for implementing at home that we'll share with you today and tomorrow. But these activities don't require any login. You don't have to install anything or sign up for anything. All you have to do is go to the page and choose the activity that you're interested in using. As I mentioned, these activities each come with their own map, and of course, the maps are chock full of data around these content areas. Maybe of greater interest to the teachers that are watching, these are all standards-based. They're based on one or more sets of national standards, depending on the relevant content that the GeoInquiry is teaching. And as I mentioned, they are, of course, content forward. In a remote or online instructional setting, the teacher can, for example, put the map up on screen and share it with students live, like in a Zoom session, and verbally walk students synchronously through the content in the activity. Or later, we'll show you how you can deliver these asynchronously, directing students to worksheets with the map URL attached. So at this point, the GeoInquiries can be very flexible depending on your teaching situation. As I mentioned, we're at 10 collections. There's 15 activities per collection using what we call a level 1 structure. So there's 150 level 1 activities that don't require any login or any sign up. We have a second type of GeoInquiry called level 2. These activities require a login. Now, the logins that you will be using for the mapping hour will suffice for using the level 2 activities. Level 2 activities engage the analysis tools in ArcGIS Online. And because of that, as a user, you'll want to have at least publisher level permissions in your ArcGIS Online account. So again, if you need an account, refer back to the beginning of this video where Charlie describes how to obtain an account. So we're going to take a quick look at what a typical GeoInquiry looks like. But fundamentally, GeoInquiries are 2-page activities. We post them, we publish them in PDF format, and then of course they include a map URL about a third of the way down where my cursor is hovering, a map URL that when clicked will launch this map into a browser window. And of course, like you would expect, the maps are interactive. All of these activities include standards. All of them include student learning and outcome. We identify the target audience near the top. So for example, this Dust Bowl activity is a part of the U.S. History collection. U.S. History is actually written for high school U.S. History classes. You could use this activity with an upper elementary student, but as a parent or a teacher, of course, you'd want to step the activity down to meet their reading level and perhaps their cognitive level. You may decide you want to simply chunk part of this activity and just use a small section of it, right? So each activity uses an inquiry model. In this case, since we're in a social science activity, we are using something called the Geographic inquiry model. Much like the science activities, we use a 5-stage inquiry model. For the science content, we use the 5E. For the social studies, we're using Geographic inquiry. Each of these activities presents a main question trying to be addressed, which is usually outlined in the learning outcome, but then each section of the inquiry presents a question for that section to help summarize and drive what the students are expected to learn by the time they complete that section. So as they finish up their 5 stages of inquiry, on the back of page 2, on each activity, there are 2 tooltip boxes. These tooltip boxes describe the extent of the technology that an educator or parent or student might need to know in order to complete the activity. These 2 technical tooltip boxes are really all the GIS that is necessary. We assume that you can pan and zoom a map under normal conditions and maybe even turn layers on and off. But these 2 technical boxes would identify any special functionality that you should be capable of doing, your students should be capable of doing in order to complete the activity. There are some next steps attached to each GeoInquiry. The next steps often describe other GeoInquiries, story maps, or learn content that your students or children can use in order to extend their learning in this particular space. And then near the bottom, for those of you that are using textbooks, There is some textbook alignment to help you position the particular activity inside of your curriculum. There's a feedback URL at the very bottom. We'd love to hear from you. But also note near the bottom right, there's the Creative Commons stamp. So particularly for the educators who want to take and modify the materials and make them more appropriate for their classroom, that is completely ready to go. The licensing is there. All we ask is that you attribute Esri and that you don't charge for your derivative products. So feel free to mark up, modify. You can even repost to the web, and we would be delighted. So that's the overall structure of what a geo-inquiry looks like. Again, level 1 content, level 2. With level 1, there's 150 activities. With level 2, we have 5 activities in about 5 different collections. And you can see those here with the little stars on them. So that would include government, world geography, human geography, and some others. So we'll take a look at this content, particularly the level 1 content today. No need to worry about it too much. Just keep in mind level 2 requires that publisher level login. So when you look at a level 1 versus level 2 page, there's 2 things to note. A level 2 has this nice little 2 up in the header. That's a sure sign that you'll need a publisher level login to use it. The level 1 activities have nothing here. And then the other thing to be aware of is for level 2 activities, you'll notice that there's a level 2 geo-inquiry requirements section. And one of the interesting things to look at is that it does tell you a little bit about how the credits will be consumed when you use this activity. Most of these activities use very minimal amounts of credits if you follow the activity as we've scripted it out for you. Okay, and this is an example of some of the analysis tools that you might see when you're using a level 2 activity. So in this case, we've got points. We've generated what's called a buffer around a point. That's the blue circle. Joseph, I think we'll talk about this more in a moment, and then we do a second bit of analysis using that buffer. So we'll get into more of this later as we review some of the level 2 geo inquiries. And I think at this point, we're going to take a look at our first geo inquiry with Kylie, and the activity that we're going to look at today is about Lewis and Clark. And I believe, looks like we're up on screen. This is actually the Lewis and Clark activity, and this was downloaded from the Esri website. It's esri.com/geoinquiries. And you'll notice, as I showed you a moment ago, that each activity includes the learning outcomes near the top in the activity description. We describe the standards, and then we go into the learning outcomes. In this section, in this particular collection rather, standards for the upper elementary collection can come from social studies or science. They can also come from Common Core. So probably of more interest to the educators in the room, you'll notice that we label the social studies standards with a C3 colon. And then the set of standards beneath that is CCSS, and that's the Common Core standards. So in this case, with the elementary activity we're looking at, we're covering an ELA standard and a geography standard. We'll have Kylie investigate this map URL with us in just a moment. But this is the map URL that you would be able to click to launch the map. And then we go into a inquiry model that's actually designed specifically for elementary education. So in this case, with the elementary collection, we actually use a 4-stage inquiry model. It's simply designed to make things more efficient and better target student learning. But effectively, this activity investigates, using Lewis and Clark as a context, the elevation change in North America, specifically in the United States. As Lewis and Clark made their journey between St. Louis and the northwest corner of the country, of course, they experienced quite a change in elevation as they followed the Mississippi River. And so this activity walks students through a focus on elevation in the United States. So you'll notice that we're going into Explore now. We're looking at and examining some of the data, so we're going to do some querying and some identification. As we begin to explain, we're going to look at what it is that's going on in terms of the elevation. How does it vary across space? And then, of course, we're going to go into the Elaborate, which is really our wrap-up section for the elementary collection. And this is trying to summarize or synthesize some of the information about how Lewis and Clark engaged the landscape and the elevation as they encountered it. Okay, and then as I mentioned, the two technical tooltips for this particular exercise. In this case, it's how to turn a layer on and off. And then, of course, how to identify a feature on a map. So two base skills that can be used not only in this activity, but in nearly every activity to come. So with that, I think, Kylie, would you be ready to share a few ideas about the map content?
Sure.
All right, Kylie, I think there you go.
All right. So this is the same document that Tom was just going through, right? And when you come in here and you know sort of the things you're going to do, you can see kind of the answers to help your student along the way. But I'm going to go ahead and jump into the map. He's gone through this. You saw some of the things that we're going to look at. So let's go ahead and open that map. And here I have it open. So when the map loads, you can see some colors on the map. There's some lines, there's some dots. And this is going to help you understand the journey that Lewis and Clark took. But first, you need to at least understand what you're looking at. So the first thing I would do when I open this map is wonder what these colors were all about. And like we saw yesterday, or in the last hour, there is a legend that will tell you this. So if you can look over here on the left, when the map loads, that legend is exposed. And you can see down here, the elevation is what those colors are all about. So the lighter pinks and the reds are those higher elevations, and then all the way down to that blues and greens of lower elevations. So you can see sort of where they started. That was in the 0 to 249 meter area. All the way through, as Tom mentioned, they're crossing out of that dark green into that lighter green. They've climbed up quite a bit. Now we're going into yellow. Yep, even higher up, maybe even as high as 749 meters. And they keep going and even hit right through here. We're going to get even higher and then back down again. So visually, I can kind of see what's going on. And that's just from looking at that legend and knowing what it's all about. Now, another thing you may want to do is learn a little about a particular area. So one of the things that you can do, because it's an interactive map, is click on it. For example, we'll click right on this little red dot. You can see some information here. And we mentioned last time this is called the pop-up. And in it, you're seeing some info, and we've looked at this before. One thing we didn't look at before is the fact that you might see a little arrow up here. Now, what that arrow does, and as well, this is a hint here too, where it says 1 of 8. I've clicked somewhere on the map, but when we're looking at this, we have a bunch of different information here, right? It's not just one piece of information. So when I click, I could see information about multiple things. So that 1 of 8 tells us that I can do that in this case. And using this arrow over here, I can make sure I flip through and see all the information available to me. In this case, we're seeing Camp Wood. We're also seeing the Illinois River is crossing that point, the Mississippi River. You know, we can flip through all these different things and then segment of their journey. So those pop-ups are going to allow us to fully explore the map. So understanding that you can flip through different ones will help your student get the most out of the content that's there by making sure they're exposed to all of it. Now, another thing that we looked at the other day is how you can turn layers on and off. One thing you may notice here is that the elevation is very loud. It's taking up pretty much your whole focus. So let's go ahead and turn it off for a bit, because while that's really the focus of this geo inquiry, I as a student may have other things I'd like to explore while I'm here. So I'm going to switch over to the Content tab, and while I'm here, I'm going to turn off that elevation. This is letting me see a little bit more clearly some different boundaries, like here versus here. Another thing, though, I may not want this base map when I'm trying to see my particular area of interest. Maybe I'm really interested in these US regions. And as you notice, the names are there, and it works great while the elevation is on. I can see those names, get an idea of what regions we're crossing, but it's a little bit hard to see exactly where they lay. So I'm going to do again, we'll go ahead and turn off that elevation. We're going to go up to the base map, and we're going to choose a different one. Now, one of the ones I like when I'm trying to focus on content that's on the map is this light gray canvas, because it basically says, leave that reference of where I am and what's going on, but make it really quiet. Let's get it out of the way. And now all of a sudden, some of our data is really starting to pop here. That route became a lot more visible. These regions become a lot more visible. And you know what? If I'm not curious about their journey right now, I'm even going to turn that off. I'm going to turn off the river. I just want to see these regions. And look how clear all of a sudden it is. I can get a sense of the content that's being presented to me and these regions. And while I could see it before and how it overlapped all the other information, Sometimes I want to dive in and focus on just the one part. All right, so just a really quick refresher, what we've used here in order to explore the map, we've turned some layers on and off. We can go ahead and bring them back as well. We've also looked at the pop-up, seen some information, switched to see what else is there, and we also looked at changing that base map to really see the most. And then, of course, the legend. Very important to understand what the data presented on the map is really communicating to us. So one thing I do want to reinforce here that I did say the last hour, but again, it's going to become important. If you come in and say you get a little excited and we go in, we turn off a bunch of stuff, and I don't remember what I've turned off, or maybe I've changed something and I can't figure out what's going on, these are saved maps. Go ahead, you're not going to break anything. Play with it. And when you're ready, use the refresh button. Just refresh the window you're on, and you're back to exactly the view you had when you started. All right, so those are the things I wanted to show with this map. And Tom, if you're ready, go ahead and hand it back to you.
Wonderful, Kylie. That was great. So what we're going to do now is take a look at another activity, this time from the American Lit GeoInquiries collection. Now, the previous activity, of course, was aimed at upper elementary. So those activities technically are targeted at grade 4. The American Literature collection is really intended for students in American Lit classrooms. And at least in the United States, that tends to be about grade 9 or 10. So what we're seeing, or what we will see here in a moment, should be more advanced content. Now, the American Lit collection in general is a little different because each activity in the collection is designed to support a particular novel commonly read in American Lit. As I mentioned before, there's 15 activities in each collection, level 1 activities, and that includes the American Literature collection. Gatsby, Then and Now, is one of those 15 activities in this collection. If your student or children have not read Gatsby, this particular activity won't do them much good. Reading a book or novels or even chapters from textbooks while they're doing the activity or before they do the activity will make this activity much more beneficial to all the learning and teaching. So as before, we've got a synopsis of the activity. We can take a look at the standards here. And of course, in this particular case, since we're on to American Lit, we're only using the Common Core literature standards. And then of course, we're taking a quick look at learning outcomes. Just as before, we've created a pop-out map that Kylie is going to help us with in a moment that explores Gatsby. Now, the focus of the Gatsby activity is really to help provide some identification of place and space with the novel that is The Great Gatsby. The interesting bit about Gatsby, of course, is that you've got a fictional story that's based on a mostly real landscape. So in this activity and in this map, we explore what the state of the landscape is, where, in this case, where F. Scott Fitzgerald and the fictional characters actually live. And then we begin to understand what the community looked like. In this case, the wealthy New York City families that lived in this part of New York state in East Egg or West Egg. And then as we continue our exploration, we're going to look at change over time. So what has happened to this space since 1900? Keep in mind, Fitzgerald wrote The Great Gatsby in about 1922. So there were some interesting changes that began right around 1900 and again right around 1920 and then again around, of course, 40 and so on. So we're going to take a fair bit of this activity really looking at change over time, both in terms of society as well as human-created constructions. So then as the activity progresses, of course, we're going to look at what happened to the mansions, again, change over time as those spaces evolved. And then finally, of course, we'll take a look at how wealth or how the people and communities in those spaces changed over time. So again, complementing the book, drawing out what's real and what's fictional, and trying to really ground this particular novel into something real. As we look down, of course, into our tooltip boxes for this activity, we're going to look at the measuring tool, which we looked at a little bit yesterday, and also bookmarks. So those are going to be our two technical tips to help us do better at working with this map. And then finally, of course, next steps. So this activity, again, is just around Gatsby. And I think when Kylie's ready, we're going to go ahead and flip it over to her this time. And she's going to show us some of the historic and current imagery and content that are in this exciting map. Kylie?
All right, so we're looking right now at that same document that Tom was just showing about Gatsby. And again, there's this clickable map URL. And when I click it, it's going to go ahead and open the map. Now, in this map, it looks a little different, right? This base map isn't like the others we looked at. It's pretty cool. It's a very historic look. You can see some certain landmark points that are kind of telling the story. You can see the garage, which from George B. Wilson. You can see the different parts in the areas. And what's interesting is you'll notice some of these say fictional and some don't. Now, that's because, as Tom mentioned, this is taking some of the real life and some of the fiction and comparing them and putting them in one map for you. So now we're going to start out. And one thing that Tom mentioned as well, the measure tool can be great here. One thing you may want to understand is the distances between different things that were going on. Now, you saw this yesterday or last hour. We can go ahead and look at it again. So if we come up on the screen here and we go to measure, we can choose to measure some distance. And what I want to do is measure maybe how far things were apart. So when I click, I can start measuring, and you can see there's a railroad there. And I can kind of follow along it, clicking, to get an idea of how far between these locations there were. All right, so next thing I want to do is show another way we can navigate around the map. So we looked at a bunch of these the other day with panning, zooming in and out, right? Those 3 things you need to know, and then you'll know most of the ways you interact with a map. Well, of course, there are others beyond just those 3. One of those is bookmarks. So if you come up here, there is a bookmarks tab. And when you click that, you can see some different places. I'm going to go ahead and focus on the Manhasset Neck right now. And that'll take you to one of the areas of the story. While we're here, we can click on features and see the pop-up, just like we did a minute ago. And again, there are multiple, and we can switch behind and learn about the different aspects. The other thing we can do while we're here is we can look at that historical data and compare it to now. Now, there's a couple of ways we can do this. So let's first look at what would happen if we go over the content and use the concept we talked about earlier of turning layers on and off. So that historical topo map is why we have this different looking background to our map right now. And if I turn it off, look what's below it. You can see right here what it is, right? So that's the imagery base map. And we can see all this different building and construction. Let's turn on that historical one again. Notice all these little dots and where they're placed. So the buildings were concentrated a little bit differently back then. And again, we can turn it on and off to see that difference. Now, you could also play with the transparency of this by coming in, going to the More options, and choosing the layer transparency. Just like Charlie played with the other day, we can slide it along and see that different transparency. Now, I find it a little bit hard to see over the imagery, so I would probably stick to turning the layer on and off in this case, but knowing the different tools can help us use the right tool for the job. You'll notice that these layers about some home values and segmentation are grayed out right now. Well, what does that mean? Well, they're grayed out because they don't display at this scale or this level of zoom, right? So we were zooming in, we're zooming out. We've talked about those concepts. And right now, these layers are gray because even if I turn them on, well, nothing happened. We're not really seeing it. So I'm going to turn off some of this so we can see a little better. And again, not doing anything. Why not? Well, they're gray. We are not zoomed to a level that they're supported. So in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to zoom out, and then you'll see it come in. So I'm just going to turn 1 on right now so we can focus on that. But this is our median home values in 2012. So one thing in Gatsby time was just that this area was a fairly wealthy area. And so by using that, we can compare that information to now. Now, again, I've clicked, but this wasn't exactly what I wanted to look at. So I need to use the arrow here to get to the information I wanted. And now I can see what I was looking for. Here's one of the block groups. You can see that cyan outline there that kind of highlights which one this is about. And it tells us what the median home value was. All right, and we can see how many homes are that value. And get some information about those different homes. I'm just pointing at the columns here. Now, if you're on an iPad or similar touch device, you'll want to tap on them to go ahead and see it. And you get that hint here that you can tap and get more information. All right, so we've looked at now some of the other, how they were transparent because of our scale level. So that's an important concept. So when something is grayed out, remember, zoom in to see more about it. There's one last thing I'd like to call out here, and it's something we sort of touched on a little bit in the last hour. But if we jump back over to the legend, you can see these different points. And this is kind of just a sneak peek at what you're going to here. So these are all done as map notes, that thing that we talked about before. And you can click and you can see information about them. So keep in mind, that's the kind of thing you can add to a map. So start thinking maybe what information you might want to put on a map and the kind of things you can do. And we'll get further into how you can do that yourself later. Now, that's my little side note. So to focus again back on what we were looking at here. We used the measure tool to understand a little bit more about this world because it is real, but also fictional. We also looked at the transparency and how we could use that to compare the past with the present and learn more about this world and the world that was written about. We used a bookmark to navigate to exactly the space we wanted. And that's really powerful. You can just put a bookmark and say, hey, just go to this bookmark. That'll start you in the right spot, and you'll be looking at what I want you to see. All right, that's what I've got for Gatsby today, Tom. So if you're ready, I'm going to hand it back over.
That's great, Kylie. Thank you. Now we're going to take a look at an earth science geoinquiry with the help of Joseph. In this particular activity, we're looking at cracked plates, right? So we're looking at Earth's crust and plate tectonics and really trying to understand how they move. So as before, we've got our science standards. So in this case, we identify that we're using middle school earth science standards. So this activity and the earth science collection more broadly are going to be most appropriate for middle and lower level high school students, but can be scaled up or down. This is a level 1 activity, so there's no login or installations required. And as before, we've got our live map URL that Joseph's going to take us to here in a few moments. Now, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, science-based collections like earth science and environmental science use the 5E inquiry model. So for educators that are trained science teachers, this should be quite familiar to you. For everybody else, we're going to think of it as 5 steps of teaching with questions around a map. So we're going to kick off this activity by asking students a really basic question, right? We're going to ask them, where are earthquakes occurring? Do they occur anywhere? We're going to launch the map and begin to ask some questions that help us get at that location of earthquakes. As we move into the second phase of our inquiry, this explore stage, we're going to be looking at relative motions of plates. So Joseph will take us through a bit of how to examine and turn on and off the relative motion indicators, and we'll understand which direction and to some degree the speed at which those plates are moving. As we go into explain, we're going to take a deeper look at what the plates are called and some various attributes about them. And then, of course, as we go into the elaboration phase, we're really trying to understand what the differences are between the plates. It's those differences that make things very interesting and begin to light up the plate boundaries with seismic activities. So in our final stage of our 5-stage inquiry model in our earth science collection, we're going to look at those boundary differences and what they do, particularly along the Caribbean and Gulf of Mexico plates. So we're going to take a look at one specific boundary line as we wrap things up. Now, with the previous 2 geoinquiries we looked at with Kylie, in this case, we're looking at using the measuring tool, which of course we've done earlier, as well as the bookmarks. So you will notice that particularly from collection to collection, there is some repetition in the tool use that's identified. Each collection, of course, as a teacher or parent uses these over time, will expose the educator as well as the student or child to a range of tools. But since we're pulling from different collections, we are going to see a bit more overlap in the tools that are identified here. And of course, like with other geoinquiries, we identify some next steps and textbook linkages and so forth. So without further ado, I think we'll see if Joseph is ready to talk us through the map associated with this activity and some of the cool elements that he saw when he was using it. Joseph?
Absolutely. Thank you, Tom. There's so much in here. This is why I wore my geography tie today, folks. There's human environment interaction. There is physical motion. There is risk assessment. But one of the ways that we can introduce this with students is, hey, have you heard about any earthquakes? Have you been in an earthquake? And then after that, where do you think most earthquakes occurred? Now, we've done this in a variety of different ways, both digital and tactile. On the tactile side, get sticky notes and put them on a world map, or have ArcGIS Online displayed on a projected surface, a projected wall, and have the students put sticky notes as to where they think most earthquakes occur. So that's a nice way of introducing this. When you open one of these maps tied to the GeoInquiries, they are modifiable, right? And we're going to modify them in various ways. This is the way the map starts. You go to the Contents tab on the left side, has one or more layers inside the map. So the way that this particular lesson starts, as you saw with Tom, is it starts with, okay, here are the plate boundaries. Where do you expect the earthquakes to occur? And one of the layers that's in here is global quakes of large magnitude, 5.8 and above. Now, one of the reasons why it's so interesting to teach geography, environmental studies, is that the Earth is a dynamic planet, right? There's lots going on, not just tectonic activity, but humans modifying landscape. We've got ice, we've got water, we've got lots of different things modifying the surface of the Earth. And this is a great illustration of the Earth being a dynamic planet. So, well, this is the larger earthquakes. How many earthquakes are in here? Okay, 1, 2, 3. No, we don't need to go there. We don't need to count every one of them because, as you know, we've got several components with a GIS. The G part is the map. The I part is the table, the attributes behind the map. And the S links the table with the map. So these aren't just a bunch of points, lines, and polygons floating around in cyberspace, but rather they have information attached to them, as you saw with Kylie. So you could look at the metadata, which is over in the About tab to the left of the map, and find out what exactly this data set entails, where we got it from, how often is it updated, etc. Or you could also, a nice way of doing it also is to take a look at the table. So for example, here we've got a year. We could sort ascending, and we can see that the year starts with 1997. And just like with Excel, you can sort in descending mode as well. So you see that, okay, we've got from 1997 to 2007, so 10 years of earthquakes at 5.8 and above. How many earthquakes are in there? You see, just like I do, that it says 2,747 features. What are features? Every single earthquake is a point on the map. So that's how many features. If you have line data, it will say the number of lines. This is points though. So a little bit of a math activity, have the students, okay, given that there's 2,747 in over a 10-year span of this magnitude, how many per year? How many per month? How many per day? So back on the patterns, relationships, and trends that you and I love looking at, but we don't care about earthquakes in the oceans, right? And usually the students are like, wait a minute. Yes, we do care about earthquakes in the oceans. Why would that be? There are possible tsunamis. We do care about earthquakes in the oceans. So as you know, we can say, okay, we can change the base map to oceans if we want to and take a look at these earthquakes occurring in the oceans but near land, okay? So how many earthquakes are in the oceans versus on land? How many would you estimate? So we can go back to the whole world then and take a look at the patterns, relationships, and trends. So these earthquakes don't just occur at random, and they are associated with these plate boundaries. And that's the next part of the lesson, actually, as Tom was indicating, is that we oftentimes in these lessons have an interesting way of approach this. So for example, you've got this absolute plate motions, which are the number of millimeters per year. So again, a little bit of a math integration. If you've got this plate moving this way and this plate moving this way, the question in the GeoInquiry, which is over here, how many different ways can you crash your car? Okay, like this, or like like an oblique angle. And so getting the students to think about, okay, when there's an earthquake, right, it's where these oftentimes, not exclusively, but many times where these plate boundaries are rubbing up against each other in some way. And that's what is what causes fracturing of subsurface material, and we know it as an earthquake. Okay, that being said, take a look at this table once again. Wouldn't it be great to find out where the largest earthquake, according to this data set, occurred? Now, I oftentimes thread that into my instruction with GIS, according to this data set, because all of the analysis that you're doing depends on the data. So it's important, as we talked about the other day, to know where the data sets come from and who created them and how often they're updated. Okay, but here we've got a 2004 at 9.0. Gosh, wouldn't it be great to find out where that is? So we can center on selection. Now, in the upper left of the map, we can actually zoom into that particular earthquake. Some of you may know this, and you're thinking 5.8 and above. This one is a 9.0, 2004. Does that make sense? Banda Aceh. Okay, so we do care about the earthquakes in the ocean. In this case, of course, caused that horrendous, horrible tsunami of the day after Christmas, the Boxing Day, 2004. So that was a 9.0. So any of these things that we're showing you right now, you can sort the table behind the data. So you can get the biggest city in a country. You can get the area in your city that has the most traffic accidents, etc. Okay, so all these things that we're showing you, you can use in other contexts. We're looking right now at the absolute plate movement. Again, a little bit of math integration. If it's 77 millimeters per year right around Australia, how long would it be before that Australian plate traveled the distance of a meter, or the distance that is your classroom? How wide is your classroom? And then how long before the Australian plate moved that distance? So again, a little bit of a math integration there. We also have a relative motion at plate boundaries layer. Now notice that it's grayed out. So Tom was indicating the last part of the lesson actually has us going into this area around the Dominican Republic and Puerto Rico. And as we zoom in there, we can see that, oh, okay, for one thing, that this trench right here, I've got the ocean's Basemap. That's actually where the plate boundary is. Notice that it's a little ways away. Gosh, there's a measure tool, isn't there? So we can take a look at either miles or kilometers, whatever units you want to use, and we can measure across there. This is about 90 kilometers. The point here is that this plate boundary layer is a global data set. So as you zoom in, it does not get more accurate or more precise, if you know what I mean. It is meant to be looked really at the continental or global scale. And so getting your students to say, you know, the plate boundary is actually really running along the Puerto Rico Trench. Circling back to the main points of the lesson, we're looking at that, yes, plate boundaries have a lot to do with where earthquakes are located. Another question you can ask is, what's the nearest earthquake to me? We also have, in terms of scale, we have a larger data set for South America. And one of the things that I think is fascinating to be able to cement home with the students learning about plate tectonics. Remember what Charlie was talking about earlier. We're really using GIS to teach about a content area, in this case, plate tectonics. Well, you've got the plate boundary running off of the west coast of South America, but most of the earthquakes are offset from the plate boundary. But just for right now, let's take a look at this filter button on the left side, right underneath the layer that says global quakes of 5.8 and above. Let's say we want to filter the data. In other words, reduce it in volume, in number. So let's say we want to have magnitude is greater than, how about 7? We just want to look at the ones that are above 7. So we're going to say apply filter. And now we only have the earthquakes on here. And I'm going to turn off the relative plate motions. And in the interest of what Kylie was talking about earlier, what if we even change the base map to a light gray canvas so we can really see, we can really focus on the content rather than the base map. And now we only have 157 earthquakes above 7 in magnitude. So this filtering tool is very powerful. And so in that last section there, I've gone through some of the questions in the actual GeoInquiry, but I've also kind of branched off. I've done a little bit of my own investigation. And so that is hopefully a clear illustration that, yes, these questions are great, and you can also move from those questions into other things. All right. Thanks, folks. All right, turning it back over to you, Tom.
Great job, Joseph. And what we're going to do now is take a look at one final GeoInquiry for this block, and it's going to be from our U.S. history collection. This particular activity is one of my favorites. It's the Dust Bowl. And maybe it's one of my favorites because I live in Kansas and I've heard stories from many of my relatives about how they lived through the Dust Bowl and the things they did. This activity really takes a look at the Dust Bowl region and how the population shifted during the Dust Bowl period, how agriculture changed, and what the resulting impact was, particularly on the population. So in this particular activity, of course, since it's a part of the U.S. History Collection, we're drawing on the C3 framework for standards, learning standards for social studies educators. We walk a bit through the learning outcomes, and as we've done with every GeoInquiry before, we've got this great map URL here that we can click to launch that interactive map. This activity uses a 5-stage inquiry process for examining questions around the relationship between population, agriculture, and precip. And, it really starts out by trying to examine what the population looked like before the Dust Bowl started, of course. And then as those agriculture practices changed and the precipitation became an effect, we really want to start digging into what happened with the farming in those regions of the Midwest. As we move on into our Explore stage, we're going to take a look again at some of the factors that contributed to this phenomena and really that relationship through a geographic lens in terms of how those attributes interacted with each other. So it's a really kind of a cool examination of understanding a pretty complex phenomena here. As we move into Analyze, we're going to take a look at what happened to the environment, what the factors were again, and then begin to look at how they evolved over time. So that period between 1930 and 1940. So we'll see some cool change over time stuff as we move into the tail end of this activity. And then, of course, finally, take again a look at the population and what happened as a net effect of the Dust Bowl. And it is kind of interesting when I think about my family in the Dust Bowl, we can literally trace back in our family genealogy what happened in terms of people's locations and livelihoods during this event. So it's quite an interesting study. For those of you, again, at home doing this maybe with student learners, as parents rather, this activity is going to be most applicable to U.S. history, probably 9th to 11th grade in most states. There's going to be a little variation there, but that's going to be the target age range. Our 2 technical tooltips on this activity are going to be looking at graphs and how we can use graphs to even extract more information out of the map. And then we're going to do a rubber band zoom. This activity, like the others, of course, provides some next steps, some textbook linkages, and the licensing rather for modifying this activity to fit your own needs. For example, maybe you're in a particular state that doesn't fall within the Dust Bowl, say California, for example. And while you weren't necessarily in the defined region, there are definitely some effects on Californians and on New Yorkers that this activity would go through. And so it would give you the opportunity to modify this activity to better reflect your local history. So with that, we're going to go ahead and turn it over to Joseph to take a look at some of the interesting GIS and content possibilities from the Dust Bowl activity.
One of the things I think is worth mentioning, when we dig into some of these very real world situations with GIS, when students say, and they're not really truly thinking when they say it this way, but, oh, there's that tsunami from 2004, cool. You kind of want to temper that with, this was a really tragic situation. Ditto with the Dust Bowl, ditto with COVID-19 or whatever else you're examining. I mean, these are really serious situations. And yes, we want to analyze it and understand it and use GIS to make our world better, more sustainable, healthier, happier. But these are pretty tragic situations. So inside here, remember, we've got the content tab to the left of the map, and you've got a variety of different layers. Let's start really simply, though, and talk about the following. The things that we've been doing with you all in these last mapping hours, you're starting to probably see that, okay, open the table, zoom and pan. There are about 10 or 12 things that if you get fairly comfortable with just those small set of 10 or 12 things, you can do anything. with GIS. You really can. It's pretty exciting. So, okay, as Tom was indicating, we've got a map. As you can see here, we've got some Great Plains states, a little bit of the Rocky Mountains, and then California, because we want to show in this lesson how farming practices and the drought situation force people to migrate. So one of the things that we are looking at here is, okay, population 1930. You can see the total population here. But I think what's also really fascinating is to compare that to the percent of counties and farms. Let's pop up a legend there. So red, lots of farmland. Red, lots of farmland. Blue, not very much farmland for various reasons, right? You've got Western Colorado there, and you and I look at this and we say, well, it makes sense. It's dry, it's arid. But now, let's say you're 13 years old. You don't really have that framework in your mind. So again, zoom in there, look at the mountains, and remember what Kylie was showing you? You can actually make some of these layers transparent. So if I do this, oh, okay, so it's mountainous, and we can't farm very effectively in the mountains, and so there's that going on as well that you can do. Okay, so one of the other things that we wanted to explore with you all is, remember, you have this zoom and pan capability with different layers. And so, for example, if you look at a certain county, let's say in north central Kansas, Smith County, okay, you've got an acreage of the number of acres of farms in 1930. And let's take a look at turning off this. And now we've got the question that oftentimes comes up is, do we have a satellite image from 1930? No, there were no satellites taking pictures of the Earth in 1930. However, we have a long history of land use practices in all parts of the world. So for example, if we turn on the percentage counties and farms, let's go ahead and make that transparent as I was doing earlier. And then let's go ahead and, as Tom indicated, we're going to band a box. This is that rubber banding. So I'm hitting the shift key with the mouse. If you have a touchpad, that's fine. You can use the touchpad, but use the shift key. So when I let go, it's just going to zoom me in to that specific spot. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the base map to imagery with labels. So this is a current satellite image. What are those squares? What are those rectangles? Now, last time I taught this in an urban area, some of the students said, well, those are office parks. No, they're not office parks. So zoom in real tight, look at the farms and the farmland, and you will see that, okay, this is an agriculture area. It was back then, it is now. But some changes have occurred between then and now, notably that much of the change beginning in the 1930s and continuing on into today was depopulation of farms, partly for the climate reason, but partly because of mechanization of agriculture. You simply didn't need that many farms anymore, but still a lot of farmland out there. Okay, so let's change the base map back to what we had before, which was I believe it was the topographic base map. Okay, so now we've got the percentage of counties and farms. What about the percent growth in the counties of farms? Less than 100% is a reduction. So this is a really fascinating part, I think, of the lesson itself. And that is, if we go ahead and look at this, remember, less than 100% is a reduction. So the dark color is a reduction in farms. Okay, so now you can see the effect. This is from 1930 to 1940, the most severe part of the Dust Bowl. And you can see, like I was talking about earlier with the worst hard time book, Southwest Colorado, or Southeast Colorado, Southwest Kansas, the Panhandle of Oklahoma, and a couple of other places had a sharp reduction in farms. One of the things that the lesson has you do is to turn on major cities. So now we see these little gold dots that are the major cities. And if we look at population change, okay, so let's pop up that legend there. So dark here is less than 100%, and it's a reduction in population. As you can see, a lot of folks moved to cities. What are you going to do when you have no farm anymore? You're going to have to go to a town and try to find employment, right? So Kansas City, you've got Wichita standing out here, Front Range of Colorado, Denver, but also California, right? So that's the whole focus of the Grapes of Wrath that many of you know. That's that following that family from Oklahoma that actually moved out to the Central Valley of California and became agricultural workers out there. So the fascinating part of this lesson, I get so excited about this, like you, this is one of my favorite lessons. I've run it, actually, you were indicating before how you can extend these lessons. I've actually run this with university students as well as secondary. So it's a wonderful lesson to extend. Last thing about the lesson that's really powerful though, folks, let's go ahead and turn on these precipitation graphs and these dust sources. So as you were looking at earlier with a couple of my colleagues, you've got some ability, remember these pop-ups? So if you turn on the precipitation graph, this is where the reasons for the migration really, I think, come to the fore. And that is, you look at the precipitation graph from NOAA, again, know your sources, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. You've got this sharp reduction in these precipitation for many of these states, okay? So last bit, the dust cloud, okay, the dust cloud. And let's say you have the students read certain sections of this lesson where it describes very briefly that dust clouds were experienced on the east coast of the USA. Where's the east coast of the USA? Oh, there it is. And last thing here, remember we have the measure tool. So in this case, I'm going to actually use miles, and I'm going to go out to central Kansas over to Washington, D.C. 1,200 miles. That's a long way for that dust to fly. There must have been a lot of dust, right? A lot of that topsoil was removed. And again, you can get into the agricultural practices and why that happened. And then a little bit of what did they do about it? Okay, how did they change some of the practices from that experience? Okay, I think I'll close it off there. Thanks.
This is great. This is such a fun activity too. You know, one thing we often do when we teach this as a part of a training exercise is to search for images on the internet where you can see those dust clouds as they're looming over or descending upon those East Coast cities. And it's just absolutely fascinating to think about that distance that dust went. So thanks for sharing that, Joseph. That was great. If you will release the screen back over to me, I have one thing I want to share, and that is I wanted to bring your attention to a story map. We talked a little bit about story maps during hour one yesterday, but we built a story map specifically to help you learn more about geoinquiries. So you can find the story map at esriurl.com/geoinquiry story map. And that will walk you through the basics of the instructional design, as well as some of the content areas that these activities touch on, and then finally some of the extensions and other cool resources that we've built to help you teach, whether it be at home or at school, with geoinquiries. With that, I think we'll turn it back over to Charlie.
Awesome. That's great. Wrapping up, remember to get your login ready for hours 4 through the rest of the series. These geoinquiries, powerful stuff. Take advantage of the geoinquiries to present different kinds of map viewer tools, the geographic features, their characteristics, and what you can see in a data table there. So wrap up the whole day here. We've got teaching with GIS. That's what you saw in this episode. Teaching GIS you saw in the first episode. So we've got the content focus on the academic information today in this episode. The context was the GIS. And in the first episode, those were flipped. So there's all kinds of ways of working with these tools to teach all kinds of activities, lessons, experiences, content. Now, the other white elements that you see in these concepts and skills are the ones that were mentioned by my colleagues going through these wonderful geoinquiries, really focusing on the GIS side of the content. If you're excited about this and want to experience more of this, remember there's the geoinquiry story map that you can get to, and you can get to the whole set of geoinquiries. And if you just want to say, hey, I missed the first hour, how do I get to that? Just go to esriurl.com/mapping hour and you'll see the collection there. Inside the K12.org, k12.maps.arcgis.com. If you want to experience some instructional documents, there's a whole collection there right on that front door of the map. You can click into the instructional documents and have similar kinds of, I want to experience, how do I get started working with GIS in a school setting. And then our friends in the Learn ArcGIS team have a Getting Started series working with ArcGIS online, and it works with the island of Hawaii and volcanoes. And so if you wanted to have an activity that is different, that is also just getting started, you can do it without being logged in. There's the address for it. And that's it for this episode. Thanks for being with us. We'll see you in the next episode.